Is it still? Good afternoon. A mere 18 legislative days remain before the end of the fiscal year, and any rational observer can see that we have a serious problem approaching. In both the House and the Senate, the appropriations process has completely broken down. 0 of the 12 bills can or will be enacted into law, yet Republican leadership continues to deny the existence of a problem. The Pope will visit the Capitol in September, but what concerns me most is that the cardinals of the Appropriations Committee appear powerless to convince their leadership to engage with Democrats in negotiations for a new budget agreement. We need a new budget agreement that replaces irresponsible austerity caps on both defense and non-defense investments with a balanced mix of closing loopholes and tax expenditures and mandatory savings that do not cut critical benefits. The serious consequences of the sequester caps are evidenced in the House bills. The House Transportation HUD bill failed to provide a single dollar of President Obama's $825 million request to help install positive train control on rail corridors, making fatal crashes like those in Philadelphia and the Bronx more likely. FEMA estimates that nearly half of its maps are unreliable for predicting flood risk, and investments in flood mitigation would save $3 for every $1 invested. Yet the Homeland Security bill shortchanges both flood mapping and the pre-disaster mitigation grants, increasing flood risk for homes, businesses, and property. The Interior bill slashes state revolving funds for drinking water and sanitary sewers, hundreds of millions of dollars below last year's level, endangering our nation's water infrastructure and public health, as well as costing 32,000 construction jobs on more than 200 projects. And the Labor, Health, Human Services, Education bill eliminates billions of dollars in grants for early childhood education, teacher development, math and science education investments that would pay benefits for the future. This does not have to be a zero-sum game, where if one side wins, the other loses. A new budget agreement would pave the way to make responsible investments, not just in our transportation infrastructure, public health, and affordable housing, but also in public safety, veterans' health, keeping armed forces the greatest military the world has ever known. But if we continue dragging our feet, and if we are forced to rely on long-term continuing resolutions or another government shutdown, everybody loses. The American people are really tired of us governing by crisis. It's time to get serious, to get to work, and I am very pleased to be joined by the once chair, now ranking member, Chris Van Hollen of the Budget Committee, and my good friend Barbara Lee, who will go after Chris Van Hollen.
Well, thank you, Nita Lowey, and it's great to be here with my friends and colleagues, Nita Lowey and Barbara Lee, and thank them for their leadership on the Appropriations Committee as our ranking member in the case of Ms. Lowey, and Barbara Lee serves both on the Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee, and also to our colleagues who are part of the Unite in support of non-defense discretionary spending. And to translate that for the American people, these are the investments that help power our economy. These are investments we make in the education of our children. These are the investments we make in science and research at places like the National Institutes of Health. These are investments we make as a country in modernizing our infrastructure, our roads and bridges and transitways to help move goods around the country and compete globally. So this is a really important part of the budget, and it's really time that Republicans come to the table and negotiate, because as of right now, as Congresswoman Lowey indicated, it's as if the Republican leadership is paddling calmly down the river with a huge waterfall ahead. And the fact that they're not scrambling to come to the table and work this out suggests that they're perfectly happy with a government shutdown, because if they don't come to the table, it's very possible that that's where we're headed. The president has put forward a budget that makes sense and provides a way out. He provides $38 billion above the sequester caps for defense and national security, and $38 billion to invest in things that help our economy grow: education, infrastructure, science and research. So he's put that forward. The House Democrats put that proposal forward as part of our budget, and yet Republicans have tried this gamesmanship with respect to the so-called overseas contingency operation funding, the war savings account, which they themselves said in their Budget Committee report of 1 year ago was nothing more than budget games. They specifically said that using OCO funds as a slush fund was a violation of the budget process, undermined the integrity of the budget process, and yet that's exactly what they're proposing today. So the president is right to say he will veto that. The House and Senate Democrats are right to say it's time to come to the table. And so we're waiting for Republicans to come and match the kind of proposal that the president's put forward, the Democrats have put forward, because the fact that they're not coming to the table with something suggests that they're perfectly happy to continuing paddling down that river and go over that waterfall toward a government shutdown. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Barbara Lee, who wants to avoid that waterfall and do the right thing. So
thank you very much. First of all, let me thank our ranking members, Congresswoman Lowey and Mr. Van Hollen, for their leadership and for inviting me to join with them today, because they have been, throughout this whole process, very courageous in speaking out in terms of our priorities as it relates to our domestic spending and, of course, in the face of severe Republican criticism. So I want to thank them very much, and opposition. But also to Emily and to Joe, thank you very much. And for all of the individuals who came here representing really families and children from all around the country. My colleagues have said it before, and it's worth saying. The last government shutdown, remember, cost us about $24 billion, according to Standards & Poor's. Now, $24 billion completely lost because of Republican obstructionism. As Congresswoman Lowey said, we have 17 days left before the end of the fiscal year, so it's time for negotiations that prevent a government shutdown and ensure responsible investments in the American people. Time and time again, either in the Appropriations Committee or in the Budget Committee, Republicans have seen vital non-defense discretionary spending as really a pot of money to be raided rather than an investment in the American people. Republicans have used these non-defense accounts as a bill payer for tax giveaways to the wealthy and to the very well-connected. These cuts mean that more Americans are going to bed hungry, struggling for a chance to succeed, and worrying about keeping a roof over their head. And so this needs to stop. Furthermore, and you know, when we talk about these cuts and these numbers, these are real people that these budget cuts are affecting with little investments to help them achieve the American dream. And when you look at how these cuts are disproportionately affecting low-income families and communities, the economic recovery hasn't reached everyone. More than 45 million Americans, including 1 in 5 children, face the harsh reality of living in poverty. Communities of color are disproportionately affected. More than 1 in 4 African American lives in poverty, and nearly 1 in 4 Latinos live in poverty. The rate for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is nearly a full point higher than the rate of white Americans. Yet Republicans continue to cut programs that directly invest in the American people. These cuts do have real impacts on families and on children and on their lives. For example, in the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee, funding for workforce training programs and education that help ensure that Americans are prepared for the jobs of the 21st century. These budget cuts have been, I think, $2.5 billion. The budget cuts from the Department of Labor, we've seen post-secondary training cut. It's really quite amazing because they cut food stamps or put work requirements and job training requirements on food stamp provisions and yet cut workforce training so people don't have the opportunity for workforce training. Colleges are going to become more expensive and will move families out of the reach, move individuals out of the reach of a college education. But these are not the type of cuts we should be making. This whole notion of robbing Peter to pay Paul, it's a scheme. We see that in the Treasury HUD bill. They tried to consolidate, well, they did, raided the National Housing Trust Fund, which many of us were proud to establish to fund the home program. And so robbing Peter to pay Paul, raiding funds to support their wealthy corporate givers is not the American way. So it's time for Republicans to put partisan politics aside. It's time to start negotiating a reasonable budget that really prevents another dangerous government shutdown. And that's what we're working on. That's what our leadership is attempting to do. And hopefully this clarion call will be heard by the Republicans, and we'll get back to the job of making sure everyone has the opportunity to live the American dream, and we need to end the sequester now.
Good afternoon. My name is Emily Holubowich. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Health Funding. Our member organizations represent millions of patients, healthcare providers, public health professionals, and scientists. And it's such an honor to be here today with such strong champions for these and other non-defense discretionary programs. I also serve as co-chair of NDD United. As the Congressman noted, it's not the greatest term, but we're working with it. And we're a campaign of more than 2,000 groups across the nation that support non-defense discretionary programs, from education and job training to housing and science to natural resources and veteran services to public health, safety, and security. Together, for the last 4 years, we have been urging lawmakers to replace sequestration with a balanced approach to deficit reduction, balanced to both how sequestration relief is paid for and how the relief is applied equally to defense and non-defense programs, as strong investments in both non-defense and defense are necessary to keep our country competitive, safe, and secure. Non-defense discretionary programs, which represent less than 1/4 of all federal spending, have been cut dramatically and disproportionately in recent years as lawmakers have worked to reduce the deficit. Even though experts across the political spectrum agree that these programs are not a driving factor behind our nation's mid- and long-term fiscal challenges. In fact, current non-defense discretionary funding is the lowest level on record dating back to the Eisenhower administration relative to the size of our U.S. economy. With sequestration relief expiring in 2016 and appropriations bills now being written to the sequestered spending caps, we are seeing firsthand the difficult trade-offs necessitated by woefully inadequate and historically low levels of spending after years of one-sided deficit reduction. For example, under the House spending bill, funding for public health, health research, and social service programs is 13% below 2010 levels adjusted for inflation. This austere funding level requires deep cuts in many programs to support flat funding or moderate increases for others. For example, the bill includes a much-needed increase of $1.1 billion for the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, which discovers cures for patients and strengthens our economy. But the discoveries developed by NIH will fall short of their promise without a strong health workforce to treat patients and respond to public health threats, without evidence of how to optimally deliver these cures to patients, and without preventive health programs and insurance coverage that facilitate patients' access to these cures. In this regard, the House 2016 spending bill would undermine these programs and ultimately America's health. And that's really what brings us together. As Congresswoman Lee noted, sequestration is about more than just numbers on a page. There are real people behind these numbers, and their lives and livelihoods are on the line. We know from our efforts at NDD United documenting sequestration's impact that these cuts have consequences, and every American pays the price. With less than 20 days left before the end of the current fiscal year, it's time for Congress to stop wasting time with spending bills on the road to nowhere and negotiate a deal to replace sequestration. Both Democrats and even some Republicans recognize sequestration is bad policy and ultimately hurts our nation. Let's work together to end this era of austerity.
Thanks, Emily. My name is Joel Packer. I'm the Executive Director of the Committee for Education Funding and the co-chair with Emily of NDD United. And as Emily said, we're not here asking for $37 billion just because we want $37 billion. These are funds that invest in America, invest in its people, invest in education, job training, public health, research, law enforcement, environmental protection, a broad range of programs that generally have very strong support from the American people. Just to give a little bit more example of some of the harm in the House Appropriations bills, the Labor, Health, Education Appropriations Bill cuts funding for the Department of Education by $2.8 billion. That's a larger cut than occurred from the sequester cut in fiscal year 2013. That would be the largest education cut ever in the history of the federal government. It eliminates completely 24 programs, more than 24 programs, including things like literacy programs, magnet schools, math, science programs. There's a lot of talk about STEM education, but the bill eliminates funding for math, science programs, school counselors, funding for the lowest performing schools to help turn them around, a whole range of very critical programs. There's also really a disconnect between the appropriations bills within the Republican side and education policy. Just a couple of weeks ago, the House passed its reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, H.R. 5, leaving aside whether one likes or doesn't like the policy in that bill. It was very purposely put together so that the aggregate authorized funding levels in that bill were this year's appropriations levels. The decision by Chairman Klein was to neither raise nor cut funding. But the House Appropriations bill, the Labor HHS bill, cuts funding for ESEA by $2.5 billion. So there's a disconnect even just within the Republican side between what they want to do on policy and what they're willing to fund. I'll just end by saying, since my organization is bipartisan, as is NDD, a lot of Republicans want to increase funding for these programs as well. During the markup, when Congresswoman Lowey, Congresswoman Lee, Rosa DeLauro, and others offered amendments, Chairman Cole, who's the chairman of the Labor Age Subcommittee, many times said, you make great points. I don't disagree with you. If I had more money, I would increase funding for preschool. If I had more money, I would put more money in Title I. I would put more money in low-performing schools. So these are not partisan programs. These are programs that need more money. And unless we raise the caps, we're in a situation where we're in a competition that if NIH gets more money, education gets less money. Or in the Commerce Justice Science Bill, if NSF gets more money, juvenile justice programs are virtually eliminated. We shouldn't have to be making those kinds of irresponsible choices. We should be investing in the people and America to make us grow, make us more competitive, create jobs, and improve innovation and our future. So thank you.
We'd all be happy to answer any questions. It's very clear that the appropriations process is going nowhere, either in the House or the Senate. And until we get together in a conference committee, as we did 2 years ago with the Budget Control Act, we're not going to be able to pass these bills. And this means jobs, it means putting people to work, taking care of our children, whether it's education, health care, a whole range of issues is very clear. Yes?
The appropriations process effectively could put on both sides of the dome. When do you see talks realistically beginning on this? And have you heard anything about the White House reaching out to leaders to jumpstart conversations?
The president made it very clear that he is ready to talk, and he submitted his budget. And I would dare say that I'd be happy to work with Chairman Rogers, and I know we've worked together, and he'd be happy to work with me, and the same on the Senate side. So the important thing is to get together. I don't know if it's be Ryan Murray or call it what you will, but there has to be a conference to get rid of the sequester, get real numbers, and get to work. It could happen very simply. I don't think it will. I'm not a betting woman, but it could happen very easily. All we could do is McConnell and Speaker Boehner could say it's time to get real, sit down, appoint a committee. We did this during the last discussion that we had. And we came out with a proposal, bipartisan, both houses supported it. They could do it. They could do it tomorrow, yes.
Question for Congressman Van Hollen. What do you make of the fact that Republicans are saying they're likely to miss the July 24th reconciliation deadline? It doesn't actually expire, they have until the next budget resolution. Does it make any difference?
Well, in many ways, it shows that their budget is as unworkable as we said it was. When I say we, my colleagues here and Democrats in the House and the Senate, I think Republicans are waking up to the fact that they cannot implement their budget without doing severe damage in the areas you're talking about with respect to reconciliation. And we're hoping they will wake up to the fact that their budget also does severe damage when it comes to the investments in education and science and research and infrastructure. So the reason they haven't gone through the reconciliation process on the mandatory side is because it would, cause great damage, and I don't think that they can pull their members together. We're hoping that they will finally come to the table so that we'll work on these issues. And the president has been very clear. He has a plan that addresses this issue. It restores $38 billion to the national security investments and $38 billion to the investments that help the economy grow. And so the Republicans' only response to that was this OCO provision, which they themselves a year ago said was a total gimmick. So that's not a serious response. So when they're ready to come to the table, we've put out a plan. The president's put out a plan. We just need them to come negotiate. Well, we'll have to see. They have still a strong part of their caucus that wants to try to, one more time, repeal the Affordable Care Act, which, by the way, would mean taking away affordable health care to 16 million Americans. And so the fact that some of them are even talking about it just shows, what a difficult job we've got ahead.
Do you think that this conversation over appropriations should be combined with the conversation over the debt ceiling, which is also coming due this winter?
December, these numbers change according to the Secretary of the Treasury and to OMB. October 1 is the end of the fiscal year. So we're going to either have to get together and work out some real numbers and pass some real bills, or having a continuing resolution. And in my conversations with many of the Republicans who have worked very hard on these appropriations bills, and many of them work together, although we have different numbers and serious disagreements. The Republican chairs with the ranking members have been working together, and I know they would prefer to have bills, but it may not be possible. And so we may have to have a continuing resolution. Yes.
Given the damage you say that the Republican budget will be causing, as well as the Republican appropriations bills, and their sort of intransigence in wanting to talk, would you sort of be better off with a CR for next year, which would at least preserve the current allocations?
I'll give you the positive and the negative. The positive of a CR is that you wouldn't have these ugly riders to have to deal with, whether it's on gun control or the right to choose or the environment. There are a whole range of riders. Last time I remember when we started our negotiation, we had about 1,000 riders when Barbara Mikulski and I sat down to deal with them. But on the other hand, the current numbers are below the president's budget, below the president's request, and when we are truly focused on educating our children, investing in infrastructure, creating jobs, it is not adequate for the future, for this year, and I would hope we get serious and could sit down and work on real bills. A lot of work has been done between Democrats and Republicans. It's just we've disagreed on a lot of the numbers and a lot of the riders.
Can I add one thing about the CR?
Yes, certainly, Joe.
So another problem with the CR is both the House and Senate appropriations bills do have some increases for some programs. So in education is a good example. The House bill increases funding for special education for children with disabilities, $500 million. In a CR, that goes away. And again, the basic point is we shouldn't be having to choose between kids with disabilities and low-income kids, between NIH and education. In a CR, everything is frozen. If we have a deal, we can get investments in this whole range of programs that even a lot of Republicans say they want.
No,
Thank
Just
you.
to emphasize on the debt ceiling, I think they should be distinct. I mean, we want to deal with the investments now before the end of the fiscal year, and the debt ceiling should be done the way we've been doing it. It should be done cleanly in terms of the.
In closing, I just want to say that we interact with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, rankings, chairs. Many of them understand, as does Chairman Rogers, that we should have a dialogue, we should get together, and we should create bills as a result of a conference that would meet the requests of the president somewhere in between, and they understand that. So continuing resolution, as Joel said, is not the answer, and I would do hope that the appropriation chairs, led by Chairman Rogers, would begin to focus seriously about it and deal with that small element of their caucus that does not want to be real about the budget process. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you again.